Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For our next session, Intelligence in the Ardennes, it's my pleasure to introduce the two gentlemen to my left. Again, brief introductions, and you can refer to your program for the more fulsome biographies. But to my far left is Colonel Greg Fontenot. Greg is a friend to the museum, having been here to speak on his previous two books on World War II, Loss and Redemption at St. Vith, and A History of the 1st Infantry Division. Greg is a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, and he will be interviewed by Dr. Bradley Hart, who is my colleague in the Jenny Craig Institute. He is one of our World War II military historians, having gotten his PhD from Cambridge, and he's the author of two books himself as well, including Hitler's American Friends. So, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss intelligence in the Ardennes, please join me in welcoming Greg Fontenot and Bradley Hart.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that very kind introduction. And Colonel, thank you so much for being here with us today for this important and I think really kind of table-setting discussion for the conversations we're going to hear throughout the day. You've written that the Ardennes could best be described as not an intelligence failure necessarily, but a command failure. And before we talk about the events of December and January 1944, I think it's worthwhile talking about the background of intelligence in the U.S. Army, which has something of a circuitous history that a lot of people aren't really familiar with. How was Army intelligence structured in December of 1944? And what were the key sources and methods that were being used by the U.S. and its adversaries at this point in the war?
I am going to address all those things right after I recognize a couple of people that I would like to do. It's probably not authorized, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you get a chance to meet Pierre Gosselin and his son from Cantigny, France, you should do that. And talk to his son in English, because he speaks better English than most of us do. And it's an exemplary example of French education. I also wanted to say that I had the honor to command a tank battalion in Desert Storm. And one of the most loyal attendees of this series of discussions on World War II was one of my scouts, who's here in the audience. Chuck Grundy, would you raise your hand, sir? Chuck was an exemplary soldier and fired the first shots in anger for my battalion on the 17th of February, 1991. So we're going to talk about intelligence in the Ardennes, and Mike Bell has cautioned me that I'm not allowed to start with the death of the last mastodon to tell you the story of how intelligence was developed. Because of my inclination, like a dog, I see a squirrel and I want to run the squirrel down. I'll try to avoid doing that. But to put it quickly, the National Defense Act of 1920 was a brilliant piece of legislation. You should call it up, read it. It was written in a time when lawyers wrote things clearly as opposed to obfuscate the point, and it is just absolutely brilliant. It organized the way the Army was going to operate in World War II. The second thing that's important about the National Defense Authorization Act is it provided for the rapid mobilization of the Army. It organized the continental United States, 3 field armies, 9 corps areas, a single regular Army division, 2 National Guard divisions, and 3 Army of the United States or reserve divisions in each of those corps areas but one. One of the corps areas had no regular Army division. That idea is how we did things in World War II, which is that we were an industrial country, absolutely motivated by the ability to produce, and we produced 89 U.S. Army divisions and had all 89 of them overseas by the end of the war. In World War I, we'd done much the same thing. In a year's time, we put 42 divisions together and got them into Europe. And that's how we organized staffs as well. This is the base manual for military intelligence in the United States Army. This is intelligence for dummies. And this is how we did things. We put in the armor manuals, because armor guys don't read, they had cartoons on everything. But curiously, they expected the infantry to read, so they actually didn't use sketches. This book is 36 pages long. That, along with several other manuals, the only long one is on photo reconnaissance. It's about 87 or 8 pages. There's about 7 or 8 manuals about how to think about intelligence. Then there's a bunch of manuals on technical data, What does a German tank look like? What does a Japanese airplane look like? So the background of this is the preparation is done the way we do everything. You know, we're going to have a production line capability. We had in the interwar period courses at the Command and General Staff College in intelligence, and you can get at that curricula. But it's true that we had no military intelligence corps. We had an armor corps, we had an infantry corps, we had cavalry, but we had no military intelligence corps. We don't bother to develop one until after World War II. So this is going to be done by amateurs. And by the way, you could say that's true of everything the United States Army did in World War II, because at one point we only had 250,000 people. By the end of the war, we had 5.5 million in the ground force. So when you grow that way, you're going to have to do some catching up, particularly with our British allies who'd been at it rather longer than we had and had a longer tradition of formal military intelligence, and they were in Europe, so they were in contact with the threat, unlike us. We were in contact with the threat to some extent in the Philippines and the Pacific, but not so much in Europe. So the other piece of this was FM 101-5, and it had two forms in it for intelligence. One was the intelligence estimate, and the second was the matter of periodic intelligence reports. So those are that's the background. What did our doctrine call for? FM 30-5, which I happen to have here, says that the job of intelligence is that of the commander. And it goes like this: the primary object of combat intelligence work is to reduce as far as possible uncertainties regarding the enemy, local conditions, and thus assist the commander in making a decision and the troops in executing their assigned mission. Pretty straightforward. And there's another interesting paragraph I'm going to read, or actually one sentence. The chiefs of arms and services are responsible for maintaining up-to-date compilation of information on the various foreign armies concerning their respective arms or services in such condition that it can be reproduced and distributed upon short notice. So you can now see that we're bifurcated, or in actually multiple places where intelligence is supposed to be done. So the tankers are supposed to track what the enemy tankers are doing. The signal guys are supposed to track. So how do you bring it all together? Well, that's going to be done in the person of the G2, which was organized, that staff system was organized in World War I, more or less patterned on the French system. The problem with that is there were no professional intelligence officers. So when you look at the intelligence officers that we're going to talk about here today, Kenneth Strong of the British at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, or SHAEF, was a professional. He had experience. Edwin L. Seibert at 12th Army Group had been the G2 of ETUSA, the European theater, U.S. Army in the European theater, but he was not a professional. He was an artilleryman. At 1st U.S. Army, Benjamin E. Dixon had graduated from the United States Military Academy, served in World War I, left afterward to run warehousing and logistics as a business, and was very good at it. So he comes back into the Army and becomes an intelligence officer. Down at 8th Corps, which is, we're going to talk about them some today, Colonel Reeves was his name. I've forgotten his first name. The next thing I want to mention, then we'll stop talking about the generals and look at some specific things at 1st Army, because we don't have time, thanks to Mike Bell only giving us 40 minutes. We won't be able to talk about all that. So Mike Bell and I have a relationship. We were briefly in the same brigade, so it's okay. We're going to be all right. The intelligence systems that we think of today, the SIGINT, COMINT, ELINT, HUMINT, all those INTs that we have today, with the exception of cyber intelligence, existed in World War II. As a matter of fact, aerial reconnaissance was first used with photographs taken and a map made of it in 1863 in the American Civil War. So we've been at it a while. Signals intelligence was quite robust in the U.S. Army. If you've ever seen Tora, the American Colonel Britton, was one of that group, and we had a number of cryptographers and had broken some of the Japanese codes. We had not any experience with the Germans. Our British allies had that, and it took until 1943 to get them to share it with us, because, as you know, no one can keep a secret in the United States. So the background then is, my argument is everything we know about and do today, we had the capability to do in some way or another in 1944. So if I can make this work. This is how the 1st U.S. Army headquarters was organized for intelligence. And the key thing to look at there is anywhere it says attached, means these guys did not belong to First Army. And when you get right down to it, very little actually belonged to First Army. The G2 Air subsection was a First Army organization, but the ground liaison officers and the photo interpretation teams were attached. When you go down to the economic psychological subsection, they have an attached document team. The special liaison unit, that's the guy with ultra traffic, you know, the cryptography that was done at, code breaking done at Bletchley Park. And finally, the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. The OSS, while Bill Donovan's organization was not welcome at First Army, Benjamin A. Dixon didn't like him, didn't want him around, so they didn't do much in First Army. You go down to the combat intelligence section, most of those guys actually belong to First Army. But if you look at prisoner of war interrogation, those teams are attached. They don't belong to First Army. Similarly, the counterintelligence, which actually there before World War II, we had a counterintelligence corps. Interestingly enough, we still didn't have an MI corps until after World War II. Those guys were attached also. So the issue here, the reason I mention this is First Army is a consumer of intelligence, actually not intelligence, a consumer of information. So the next thing I want to show you is how that related to the other players. And these are documents, these are copies of artifact documents from First Army, by the way. These aren't charts that I made. So if you look at who they had to collaborate with, it's all those guys that you saw earlier and some others. So the job of the First Army is, job of any G2 includes two fundamental things that are not the same. They function in different ways. If you take bits of information, you're doing analysis. That is deductive reasoning. In the course of doing the analysis of deductive reasoning, you begin to see patterns, and then you begin to draw conclusions about those patterns. That is synthesis or inductive reasoning. So you have two different functions that you have to do. Intelligence is the product of combat information that's been analyzed, and then a synthesis that leads you to draw conclusions about what enemy capabilities and intentions might be. So when you think about that, these competing ways of approach, analysis is what Americans are most comfortable with at this point. Thinking inductively, putting the bits back together to produce an estimate is rather more complex. And that, the responsible person for that is the commander, not the intelligence officer. Now I can tell you, because I spent 28 and a half years in the United States Army, commanders like nothing better than to batter, brutalize, traumatize, cause all kinds of grief for intelligence officers. Intelligence officers, as a consequence, always hedge their bets. On the one hand, the enemy might do this, but on the other hand, they might do this other thing. And on the third hand, and if you let them, they'll have 5 or 6 hands. So the problem we have also relates to how people operate. And we're going to see, as we talk about this, that personalities in the intelligence mattered. Edwin L. Seibert and Kenneth Strong think that Benjamin A. Dixon is kind of an alarmist. Colonel Reeves at the 8th Corps, I can find out nothing about the guy. If the guy ever had an opinion, I don't know what it was. His deputy G2, on the other hand, William A. Sladen, had lots of opinions and freely shared them with anyone, so I know something about what he thought. So that's the background. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how did that turn out. And so I think the next thing we want to talk about is what was the situation in December?
Yeah, so against that backdrop, what is the strategic situation in the Ardennes in December of 1944, and how does this sort of unusual arrangement of U.S. intelligence feed into what happens?
I'm going to resist the temptation, thanks to Mike Bell coaching me on it, not to go back and start with D-Day, and instead say that as of September the 11th of 1944, the 1st Infantry Division, which you can read about in my brilliant yet concisely written book, No Sacrifice Too Great. And if you don't like it, you can always use it as a doorstop. But the 1st Infantry Division is outside of Aachen, Germany, within a kilometer of, 2 kilometers of the city, on the edge of the first of 2 sections of the Siegfried Line. There's a line forward of Aachen and one to the rear. At this point, the 1st U.S. Army, and for that matter the Allies, with the exception of the 21st Army Group, Montgomery's Army Group, has culminated. They have run out of fuel. Operational ready rate of their armor is about 45 or 50%. Now, I don't want you to get too misty-eyed about the Americans because the Germans, by comparison, are in far worse shape. The German Army had 1,552 tanks, allegedly, on D-Day in Army Group B, the part of the Army that we're talking about, the Army organization we're talking about. And they only have about 100 left by the time they get to the Siegfried Line, possibly even less. What we do know is while they were retreating, literally running back to the Siegfried, the German Army showed, as it had multiple times, Bradley put it this way, an astonishing recuperative capability. They built 40-odd, some people say as many as 100 fortress battalions, which were battalions of, old men, youngsters, wounded guys returning to service, that kind of thing. And some of them weren't very well trained. But as an operations officer of an infantry regiment pointed out, you didn't have to be super well trained to shoot an MG-42 out of the aperture of a bunker. And there were lots of bunkers on the Siegfried Line. In fact, one of the fights in Aachen, there's 21 bunkers that a company had to take just to approach the city of Aachen as part of the defense of the Siegfried Line. So when you look at that problem, here we are, we're about 30 miles, 35 miles from the Rhine River, and we don't get across it till March of 45. When they get into fortified positions and go into what Dr. Rob Citino refers to as Stellungskrieg, or fortress warfighting, the problem gets difficult for us. The flip side is the Americans are crazed about offensive operations. Our Army was organized and mechanized to fight a war of movement. Again, quoting Dr. Citino, what the Germans call Bewegungskrieg, not Blitzkrieg, Bewegungskrieg. This war of movement, this mechanization that enabled us to do that, produced incredible agility. Everybody talks about how quickly Patton turned around. What nobody wants to tell you about Patton is 3 Corps headquarters was not in the line, neither were those divisions that went north. And the 3 Corps headquarters in World War II, like all other Corps headquarters, was authorized 100 people. 100. So you're not talking about a big deal to move. U.S. Army Corps headquarters now, because it has administrative responsibilities and a gazillion computers, is about 800 strong. First Army headquarters had about 35 officers in the G2 section, so it's much bigger. So most of that work of administrative work, logistics, and the rest would have been done at the Field Army. The other quick thing I want to mention about this, and then we'll stop, is that we were trying to get ready to return to the offensive. Both in First Army and Third Army, we had offensive operations planned. I think we'll let it go there and then talk about some of the misses that we had later on.
Yeah, I think, as you alluded to already, intelligence is fundamentally a human endeavor. And you've alluded to some of the key personalities in U.S. intelligence during the Battle of the Bulge, but who are the big players here, and how do their relationships shape what happens?
Yes, that's a great question, and one of the things I want to start with is Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower did not take any of the intelligence courses at CGSC, at Command General Staff College. Intelligence was not the way to get ahead in the U.S. Army. Kind of interesting when you think about that. The operators didn't want to... Yeah. Yes, I know. I, too, was an Army officer, so But and that's the reason I went and became an intelligence professional in civil service, because as I pointed out to my intelligence colleagues, intelligence was too important to be left up to intelligence officers. So the issue for Eisenhower was he had political masters, commanders at that level. The theater commander works for the policymakers. And it's really important for us in this room today to think of who the policymakers are. A lot of the criticism of Dwight Eisenhower was that he didn't focus on the military side of that. Well, he didn't have a chance to do that because he worked for 2 policymakers, both Churchill and Roosevelt. And by the way, Roosevelt reached down to Eisenhower's level very seldom. Churchill didn't feel that restraint. He often was talking to Eisenhower. I was talking to Professor Nigel Hamilton just before this started that if anybody really thought in the broad front versus narrow front argument that the United States was going to turn over several field armies to Montgomery in order to have a narrow front attack on the north side, which is probably where it should have gone, they're not paying attention because politically that was impossible. The problem for the British is different because they're like us, they're running out of troops, but they've been at it a lot longer and their manpower problem is much bigger than the Americans. So when you get into SHAEF, Kenneth Strong, world-class soldier, in my opinion. Alan Brooke referred to him as a chinless wonder, which is a little unkind. He was not sufficiently loyal in Alan Brooke's point of view to the British perspective, and I'll be glad to take slings and arrows over that later. At 12th Army Group, Edwin L. Seibert was a friend of Bradley's. Not surprisingly, Bradley trusted him. Benjamin A. Dixon, arguably the 1st Army G2, arguably had some angst and irritation over not being the Army Group G2 because he had been Bradley's G2 both at 2nd Corps in North Africa and in 1st Army. And when Bradley fleeted up to be the Army Group commander, Dixon thought he might go up and become a brigadier general. Instead, Dixon stayed at 1st Army and retired as a colonel, which is not the most awful thing that's ever happened to anybody. But Dixon had some resentment, I think, about that. In the 8th Corps, as I said, I don't know much about Reeves, but Sladen, and you can understand the 8th Corps perspective by reading the periodic reports and the G2 estimates. And do we want to talk about that now, the estimates, or do we want to move on?
Yeah.
So the way that there are some things about the Ardennes that I think are myth, one of which is nobody could fly in November and December. It's not so. There were plenty of photo reconnaissance missions being flown even in December, even in 1st Army. The 67th Aerial Reconnaissance Group, which had 2 squadrons of modified P-51 Mustang airplanes to do photo reconnaissance, flew. Was that a statement about?
I don't know. Interesting timing.
Yeah, I don't know what that was all about. The operations group, or operations reports of the 67th's 2 squadrons are available at the National Archives and Records Administration. I have them, I've read them. Then I've also had a chance to read the photo reconnaissance interpretation reports of those little groups of people that were attached to 1st Army. One of the problems with the 8th Corps area is we weren't flying over it. The last reconnaissance mission flown over the 2nd Infantry Division, part of the frontline trace, which is just east of Saint-Vith, where the 106th Division eventually surrendered 2 regiments, was flown in the last week of November. When you go back to FM 30-5, this wonderful little manual, one of the key things you're supposed to talk about as an intelligence officer is terrain. So when you look at the terrain, Anthony Tucker Jones showed the map of the 5 routes for the 6th Panzer Army. In the Eisenhower Library, and I now have a copy of it, is the original sector sketch, or rather route sketch, the Germans did, Wegskizze Teil 1 to be precise. And it shows those same 5 routes, but along those 5 routes, it shows where the tanks can't go. And there is none of those 5 routes will allow a Tiger tank, let alone a King Tiger, to go all the way through. So you'd have to go from route C to D and E, back and forth, to find places to go. So when you look at the terrain in the Ardennes, which we did, we concluded they aren't going to go there. Well, as Troy Middleton had pointed out to Bradley in a meeting, and Troy Middleton was the 8th Corps commander, the Germans had gone through there 1870 and 1914 and 1940. And then they go through again in 1944, and I've told people that I'm pretty sure if the Germans attack Belgium again, by God, they're going to go through the Ardennes. Because that's what they do. Now, the Ardennes was impenetrable, supposedly, in 1914, impenetrable again in 1940, and certainly it was going to be impenetrable in 1944. And if you go into the Ardennes forest, and the Ardennes forest is really 3 forests, the Hurtgen, just south of Aachen, the Eifel, Schnee-Eifel, snow plateau, or as a 106th Division soldier said, he thought it meant a hell of a lot of snow, and the Ardennes proper in Belgium. It's about 80 miles long, about 15 miles north to south at its thickest point. And when you get in there, it's cold and wet and misty in the summer, let alone in the winter. It's a tough place to go. And the intersections, the terrain creates these possibilities for road traffic, results in intersections. At Saint-Vith, there's 5 routes, and there's several more at Bastogne. So that is the background problem. And from our analysis, we say, look, this is, it's too hard for them to do this. And oh, by the way, we know they're running out of fuel. But we also know in October, I think it was, 1st Army reports that in its periodic reports and summaries, which are estimates, it notes that the Germans have reached a 900 tank production per month. So they're recuperating now. And we start picking up on that in October. And if you look at G2 estimate number 34 of the 1st U.S. Army, which I have right here, it says point blank, and this is Dixon's analysis, that the German doctrine of defense calls for counterattack. And he assumes the passive defense only when he is powerless to do anything else. And he goes on to say that he is convinced that they have, as a number 2 capability, the enemy has capability of simultaneously attacking the 9th U.S. Army, 2nd British Army, with all or any or all of 3 Panzer divisions now in reserve west of the Rhine, with the object of retaking Aachen and forcing the Allied withdrawal. Then he goes on to say they could even attack all along the front. So in October, he's alarmed. So is Kenneth Strong. So they talk to Bradley, and at that point, Middleton's asking for help, but Bradley will not put off his offensive operations, so he's going to continue to do that. In estimate number 35, 2 weeks later, they do twice a month. G2 estimate number 35, he talks, and there are several pages of this, but what he really says is the enemy is capable of an offensive against 1st U.S. Army. That's the 2nd capability. And then he says, it is now a race against time. Can the enemy complete his dispositions for his offensive prior to the launching of our attack? So early on in October, they see these units forming. Using aerial reconnaissance, Ultra, which is still talk, and one of the other myths is, they didn't use Ultra at all. Well, that's not true. They kept using Ultra. Even though they had telephone communications, there's still Ultra traffic. And there's plenty of it on the diplomatic side. Sadly, the diplomatic side doesn't get shared with the troops on the ground. Let me say that again. The traffic being monitored on the diplomatic side doesn't make its way into the ground forces in 12th Army Group. And that surely is a problem that could not continue to this very day. Or perhaps it could. In any case, there's plenty of evidence of them gathering. We know that the 5th Panzer Army and the 6th Panzer Army are forming up in north of Cologne, for the most part, north of Cologne. We also have a deception plan. We want them to think that we're weak in the 8th Corps area. How interesting. And of course, they were happy to think that because they knew it for a fact, and that's where they're going to attack. I think we'll let it go there, and maybe we ought to talk a little bit about who the policymaker is on the German side when we get to the German point of view.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I think it's fascinating that G2 assessment of the Germans are going to attack because that's the way they perceive the war developing is entirely consistent with Hitler's own view, this obsession with Frederick the Great and the idea that if you're not attacking constantly, you're losing effectively. Yeah, let's talk about the German side for a moment. What is the state of German intelligence during the Bulge, and what do they know?
Yeah, and we're going to do that, but I'm going to come back to the last 2 estimates of the last of November and the 1st in December. So from the German point of view, the number one thing to remember is the United States and the Allies generally thought von Rundstedt was running the war. As C&C West, or Oberbefehlshaber West, the Obergruppenführer, the guy who gives orders in the West is what that means. We assumed he was running it. He wasn't, because he's not the policymaker. People can say what they want about whether Hitler should have been doing these things or not, but he's the policymaker. You've heard about the 8,000-mile screwdriver where the guy from the top reaches all the way down to the soldiers in the field? That happens still. So the idea that general officers run the show without deference to their policymakers is ridiculous. It's not true. And Hitler had been looking at this problem since November of 43. In almost the same week, in November 1943, at Cairo and Tehran, the Americans and the Allies settled on their strategy to include Overlord, what happened in the spring and summer of 1944. And the Germans had the same outcome. Führerbefehl 51, issued by Adolf Hitler, noted that they had strategic depth in the east and none in the west, and so he was going to shift his main emphasis from the east to the west. Guderian and his friends, as you saw earlier when Anthony Tucker-Jones was talking, fought that. Generally speaking, they didn't fight it up front, but so you get an order sent to a unit to move from the east to the west and say, yeah, we'll get right on that, and they would delay and they would find reasons they couldn't. The dog ate my homework, whatever it was, they would find a way to delay. And the same thing is happening, by the way, in this competition for resources isn't just in Germany. that's happening in the Allied side as well. We didn't have enough landing craft at one point because there were too many landing craft in the Pacific and too many of them in the Mediterranean and not enough of them in the Channel. That kind of thing is not new. You know, squabbling over resources has gone on forever. If you ever raised kids and there's one thing and there's two kids, there's going to be a fight. And that's just a fact of life. The thing about German intelligence is this. They had very good tactical intelligence. In the 8th Corps area where the fight took place, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, a new division recently formed out of troops from Silesia and grounded Luftwaffe, mechanics and the like, is formed up, and about 6 weeks later, they're on the line. They're patrolling. They're getting past the flot, past the forward line of troops, past the outpost, and into our rear area, tactical rear. So they know where we are. They're not confused about that. They too use SIGINT and command. One of the first things that happened on December the 16th, for that, as a matter of fact, the phone rang in a regimental headquarters of the 106th Division. It was the Germans that, hey, we just took over the battalion command post of X battalion, and we're coming to get you next. So the idea that they had sound tactical intelligence. They were also flying aerial reconnaissance as well. Now, when you read about the weather was too bad, that's true. But it isn't uniformly bad across the front. So you get someplace where an operations report for a reconnaissance mission would say 7/10 cloud cover, cumulus, base at 3,500 feet, top at 8,000 feet, or whatever it was, but they got a hole, and they could look at the rail yard at Euskirchen or whatever town they were looking at. So the German intelligence was pretty good, I'd say first rate. And I'd like to point out that Model and Manteuffel both were in the Schnee Eifel making personal reconnaissance as commanders do. Let me say that again. Field Marshal Model goes out on the ground himself where the attack is going to take place, and he takes a look. Does it at night, so he's not going to get killed. And Manteuffel did the same thing. So their intelligence was quite good, in my opinion.
So December 16th, 1944, we have the launch of what becomes the Battle of the Bulge. Intelligence failure / command failure. You've made the case for a command failure. Whatever it is, what does the Army do to improve this going forward? What do they do?
Rapidly, and Eisenhower takes credit for this because he was the commander. We're on the broad front strategy, which means he had 33 divisions in U.S. divisions, and I think it was 12 Commonwealth divisions and a couple of French divisions. So he had about 55 or so divisions on a 500-plus mile front. And as Hitler pointed out, the Germans in the West at this point have as many troops as the Allies do. And that's another thing people don't know. And they concentrate, as Anthony Tucker-Jones pointed out, to get about a 4-to-1 advantage in the 8th Corps. So you have an incredible advantage, or incredible situation that can take advantage of. So how do we correct these kind of things? How did this happen? Well, it happened, according to Forrest Pogue, for basically 4 reasons. Forrest Pogue is the author of Supreme Command, which is the Army, official Army history of that level of command, that is to say, SHAEF command. He said that the main problems, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, is our focus on returning to the offensive mission, which was super important. I said to you earlier, we were organized to attack and to fight a war of movement. And to give you an example of that and follow up on the quality versus quantity thing, the quality of German weapons did not get to every place. The Volksgrenadier divisions in 1944 had an authorization of 2,000 vehicles. 1,800 of them were horse-drawn. The authorization of an American infantry division was only 1,800 vehicles, none of which required a horse. So we were fully mechanized or motorized by comparison to the German infantry. We thought von Rundstedt was in charge. He was not. The policymaker was directing the policy and the strategy, which is his prerogative. And they had a fuel shortage. That's true. They were able to get, I think it was 3 fuel loads or 3 days worth of fuel for the attack. And finally, if they did attack, the war would end quicker. Now, how does the Army cope with that problem? Because the other problem that's not mentioned by Pogue that I think is valid here is we lacked empathy for the Germans. I'm not talking about sympathy. We weren't, sympathetic to Nazism, but we had no empathy for them. We couldn't see it from their point of view. If you have a doctrine of unconditional surrender and almost everybody has to be a Nazi in order to advance anywhere, you know, why would you give up? If you're fighting on the Siegfried line to protect the city of Aachen, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, where Charlemagne was crowned as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 805 AD, why would you give that up? You know, would you give up Cologne Cathedral without a fight? Great line in the movie Fury. It's in March of 45. He says, why are they still doing this? And the company commander talking to the sergeant says, well, what would you do if it was us? So they're going to fight. And Anthony Tucker-Jones pointed out their morale was good. So after World War II, how do we sort this out? CIC over time became the Army Security Agency, and then later on it becomes, you know, SSA, and now it's NSA, National Security Agency. We developed the Military Intelligence Corps, and in the 80s we developed military intelligence units that would able to generate combat information that could be turned into intelligence for units in the field. The OSS becomes the CIA with all that implies, good and bad, and aerial reconnaissance increasingly has improved to include satellite imagery and the rest of it, but you still have to have somebody do the thinking about going from the analysis to the synthesis. You have to go from deductive to inductive reasoning. You have to be able to distinguish between capability and intentions. And at the end of the day, even AI, somebody has to write algorithms to make the AI work. Human intervention is going to be required. Judgment is going to be required. And I also would argue the Army's done a lot to fix this, as has the nation. But I submit to you, as long as humans are involved, hubris, lack of empathy, mistaken judgment, commanders having to make choice, policymakers intervening, you're going to have situations that don't turn out well. And one quick example, and then I'll shut up. During the course of the Vietnam War, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the service chiefs were had a discussion with President Johnson. And Johnson was being urged by the chiefs to go north into Vietnam, North Vietnam. You can't win this war, they thought, unless you went conventional and went into North Vietnam. And the argument was over whether or not the Chinese would intervene. And the service chiefs tried to assure Johnson that they would not. But Lyndon Johnson remembered MacArthur in 1950. And so he called him lots of vile and profane names, as only Lyndon Johnson could. And he directed policy that precluded us from going either into North Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos. We could argue the rest of the day whether that was a good decision or not a decision, but it was his decision. It was his prerogative. So even at the national level, it is the commander, not the intelligence professionals, that are responsible for those decisions. So if I do write a book about this, and I'm thinking about it, I'm going to call it Ike's Intelligence Failure, The Battle of the Bulge. And we'll see where that goes.
Let us know when it comes out. Definitely want to get a copy of that. I think we're ready to open up the floor to questions here. I'm sure there's a ton. And thank you for a fascinating discussion here. This has been a great, I think, prelude to what we're talking about the rest of the day. Let's go to the floor for some questions.
Please raise your hand, and I will come over with the microphone. Any questions? We have one in the front.
Thank you very much, Colonel. So I think it's on December 17th. Supposedly Omar Bradley said, "Where the hell has the son of a bitch gotten all this strength?" True, and what role does Bradley play in everything that takes place?
Yes, it is true that he said that. It is also true that the only guy who understood how serious the problem was when they met at Verdun at 6 o'clock in the evening was Dwight Eisenhower. And thanks to Eisenhower, the 7th Armored Division went south to Saint-Vith. The 10th Armored Division got 2 company-sized combat teams on the road east of Bastogne, allowing the 101st to get in. And the rest, as they say, is history. Yes, he did say that. But he's also the guy that said he was always amazed at the astonishing capacity of the Germans to recuperate. And the Germans, there's a lot of myths about the German army. But it's not mythical to say that the Ersatzheer, the replacement army, did remarkable things. One of the best after-action reports of what happened in the Bulge was written by the air intelligence officer for SHAEF. They moved 1,600 trains to bring those troops in. And we got pictures of a lot of them. So yes, Bradley said that. Bradley was so focused on his offensive intentions that he was taken unaware.
We will stay towards the front.
Two questions for you. One, could you spend a little time talking about Oscar Cotch, Bradley's G2, who was his intelligence officer who figured out a little bit about what was going on in the Ardennes? Two, about Otto Wiegand, who was the Air Force general that worked with Patton to give him an overview of what was going on in the Ardennes?
Well, first of all, with all due respect to General Cotch, and he's not here to defend himself, he didn't have any better an idea than anybody else did. One of the things that Kevin Himmel, or Heimel, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, has learned in the context of going through all the records to include the diary is Beatrice Patton altered Patton's diary so that things that he said ex post facto, after things had happened, appeared to have been said before it happened. So, you know, laugh if you like, but I've depended on the Patton diary for a couple of things. And when you discover that Mrs. Patton was messing with, it's kind of like old dead Carl von Clausewitz. Is it really his book, or did Mrs. Clausewitz write some of that? Because she wrote it, you know, she finished it after, she edited it after he died. So I'm not a big Patton fan. I'll just admit that up front. Patton's bluster, and you know, I think he was a sociopath, but he was very good at killing Germans, and that was his job. But he and Oscar Koch had no more idea than anybody else did. Everybody could see the buildup. That's a capability. An intention is different from capability. They have the capability to do A or the capability to do B. In fact, on the 10th of December with Estimate 37, we never did get back to that, Dixon's saying, hey, look, they're going to come. Well, his argument they were going to come got kind of deflated when he went on leave on the 14th of December, which is what Hodges said about it. But if you're Benjamin Dixon and you're being dismissed as an alarmist, as he was being dismissed, and on the 12th of December, Seibert's headquarters at 12th Army Group issues an estimate, part of it written by a man named Ralph Ingersoll. And if you ever want to read a truly vitriolic memoir full of Anglophobic arguments, you need to read Ralph Ingersoll's book, Top Secret. Between Ingersoll and Chester Wilmot, they started a 40-year war of biographies and memoirs between the Brits and us about whose fault it was that we didn't win the war quicker. But Ingersoll wrote in there that the troops in the field couldn't see what they did at 12th Army Group, and therefore they didn't understand how badly the Germans had been beaten. It's part of that hubris thing, but it was also to put down Dixon. So Oscar Koch had the same idea that Dixon did. He just didn't know whether the capability was going to be executed. The second question you asked was about the 9th Tactical Group, Pete Quesada. The tactical air forces in World War II, by the fall of '44, had dealt with problems that they had experienced in North Africa and Sicily, so that the tactical air forces were a brilliant part of the ground fight. I don't think the Air Force is enthusiastic about that now as Pete Quesada was in 1944, but they were brilliant. And I don't know if that answers your second question adequately or not, so if it does not, let me know.
Our next question will be over to your left.
Thank you, sir. Great update on the intelligence in the Ardennes. I wonder if you make a comment about the concept of mirror imaging. You know, and that is, we're looking at intelligence and we say, well, we wouldn't do that, so the Germans aren't going to do that. And the example you kind of touched on was we knew the 5th and 6th Panzer Army was there, and we said, well, they're going to block us from going to the Roe River Dam. But in Forrest Pogue's thing that you talked about, he laid out over and over how POWs were coming across saying there's going to be an attack. Belgian civilians would look and come back across the border and say, the Germans are massing, there's going to be an attack. There's all this information, but maybe they just couldn't get over, the concept of mirror imaging. Well, we wouldn't attack in this weather, so they're not either. Just wondered if you make a comment on that.
I think mirror imaging is certainly part of it. The last thing I did in the United States Army was I ran a school for red teaming. And what our intention was to try to teach people to understand how the other side looked at it, to achieve empathy for the other side. And to give you an example of that, if you read, Germans are from the Western culture. It's not, you would think it's not completely alien, but they don't think like we do. And I don't mean that as a pejorative matter. People think in their own language. Culture matters. And the German point of view was just something we couldn't fathom. So mirror imaging is part of it, but I don't think that's an adequate explanation. I think the explanation is Americans hold the absurd and ridiculous view that people are the same everywhere. Trust me, they are not. I thought I knew something about Bosnia because I did a master's degree in the coming of World War I from the British point of view. Well, I went to Bosnia with 5,000 of my closest friends to impose peace in 1995. And I recognized when I got there that they looked just like Europeans, but they weren't. They thought differently. I went to Afghanistan. Trust me, they don't see things the way we do. Nor do they in Iraq. So one of our fundamental problems in the United States is we refuse to consider what other people might do because the presumption is everybody wants to be like us. And it's just not true. So I understand the point about mirror imaging, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough. The only guys that when I did a book on Desert Storm, where I got to read the translated documents that came out of Hussein's headquarters down to, in some cases, division. And when you read that, the only people that misunderstood the other worse than us was the Iraqis. At one point, the Iraqi foreign minister, you and I talked about that last night, opined to Mr. Hussein that the Americans were angry at us over the invasion of Kuwait as much because they had supported Puerto Rican statehood as anything else. Even Hussein thought that was a reach. So if you aren't willing to take the time to understand the other side, you're never going to get it right. To Benjamin Dixon's credit, he would only accept in the G2 officers who spoke French and or German, because at least he wanted people that could read the documents. Because when you read a German document and you translate it literally, it will often make no sense. You have to be able to think of it from the German point of view. Now, I'm not very good at that anymore, but there are people in this room, I'm sure, can read German who understand when you read a certain German phrase, it may not mean, the literal translation is probably not right. You're not idiomatically correct, so you're not getting the way they thought about it. That's a very long answer, I'm sorry, but I think it's an important one.
Next question will be in the same area.
I've got two questions. You had made reference to the fact that it was a shame that the diplomacy was not getting to the men on the ground. Can you go into that? And then secondly, with regard to intelligence, the fact that Germans were dressing up as GIs and coming in and causing problems, was that overblown or was that a significant problem?
Well, yes, it was overblown, but it was a significant problem. Yeah. So if you're Dwight Eisenhower during this time, they won't let you leave the headquarters. I mean, this guy's a 4-star general. He says, "Hey, I want to leave the headquarters," and Sergeant Smith says, "No, we can't let you do that." Eisenhower did not find that amusing. These guys caused confusion, and I suspect there were some people shot by accident. And it happens all the time. Again, a quick war story. In Bosnia, during the trial of OJ, if it does not fit, you must acquit. Everybody remember that. There was an intelligence estimate, or rather an intelligence report sent down to the brigade level that said there was a guy, a black guy, wearing American BDUs who was a terrorist, and we ought to be on the lookout for him. And so I gave a brigade order. We're not shooting any black guys. Because how do you know? How can you possibly know? And so you get people getting stopped, and you want to know, the famous movie, what's a Texas leaguer? And if you don't know, you're liable to get shot. Who are them bums was one of my favorite questions. That's the Brooklyn Dodgers, of course, but, not everybody knows that. So, yes, it was overblown, but it was a real problem at the same time.
Next question towards the front.
Thank you for a really excellent talk on this matter. Clearly, I think the most important command success in this thing is how quickly Ike recognized that this was really a serious effort. I've always wondered what led him to that, and I wondered whether there was some diplomatic intercepts that he was looking at where Hitler's talking to the Japanese ambassador, where he's talking, I think it's in like September, October, or early November, about a big offensive in the West. And I was wondering whether you think Ike was channeling that.
Well, that is a very important question. I'm not sure I'm fully competent to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. So at the theater level, you're not thinking about the fight tomorrow or the fight tonight. You have to think about the fight in terms of where do I want to be 7, 8 months from now? It sounds crazy, but that's how it is. In the Army, we call that backwards planning, or rather backward planning. Backwards is what we do often, but that's not our intention. Backward planning is you start at the end, and what has to happen to get there? What are the sequences that have to occur? And the other thing about that is that Eisenhower was a well-educated man. He was a bright man to start with. The old story about Fox Connor, mentoring Dwight Eisenhower and George C. Marshall doing it. He did staff work for Douglas MacArthur, which is a miserable human being to work for, apparently. But Eisenhower, by the time he was lieutenant colonel trying to get a battalion command in Patton's 1st Armored Division, he knew staff work. He understood how to do it. I think he also had great skill at understanding time distance, maybe partly because he was part of a convoy that went across the United States in the 20s, and that inspired him to think about time distance. And he also was a trainer of tank crews at Camp Colt in World War I. For all of those reasons, and if you want to get a good insight into that, I still think one of the best books about Eisenhower as a Supreme Commander is Stephen Ambrose's book, which he published in 1970 or so, and I'm pleased to report I have an autographed copy of it because he was one of my professors. But one of the things that Ambrose talks about is Eisenhower's growth. And Eisenhower grew considerably. He in North Africa, he made a couple of really bad mistakes. And one of which was to try to seize Tunisia by coup de main. Let's go right now, even though we're not ready. And he learned from that. He was the kind of officer that everyone should aspire to be, that you learn in each job you do. And that means you have to be willing to think about your performance from a critical perspective. You mentioned Fred the Great. So old Fred wrote wrote several books. And one of those things that he pointed out was that the military profession is an honorable profession, but a lot of people that serve in it aren't particularly critical in their thinking about what they did. So they become like a mule who carried the bags for Prince Eugen on 13 campaigns. At the end of those 13 campaigns, Prince Eugen's mule remains a mule, or as I prefer to say, a jackass. So if you learn nothing from what you've done, you aren't willing to consider mistakes, you don't improve. Dwight Eisenhower did all of those things. And the only officer I think was even better at that than he might have been Matthew Ridgway. And you could argue that Montgomery was one of those men. So the ability to think critically about your own performance is an important aspect to success as a soldier, or any profession.
Question in center aisle up front, gents.
Like to know if what was the reaction in the Battle of Bulge on the home front in the U.S. and what President Roosevelt's reaction? Did he make any public statements or just kind of could talk about the domestic domestic situation as the battle went on?
Well, it was astonishment was the main thing, because everyone was under the impression, those at the front as well as those in the home country, that things were going swimmingly and the war would be over soon. It was a wake-up, is the best way to put it. Shock and amazement. Roosevelt, to his credit, in my opinion, did not manifest his disappointment or concern by haranguing Eisenhower or Marshall, either one. Marshall, also to his credit, dealt with these things really, really thoughtfully. Getting ready for this, I read the Eisenhower papers, the edited papers from September through January. And in no way is there any criticism that's unwarranted, and there's no meanness in any of the communications coming from the rear to the front. So to the extent that it made sense, Roosevelt protected his key people from that. But in the home front, there was a lot of angst. And then there was an unfortunate press conference that Monty made after the Bulge, in which he appeared to have taken credit for things that would have been unreasonable. It's not fair to him to say that, because the guys who really made all that happen is the British tabloids. And Nigel Hamilton's here. He's going to presumably talk about some of that. He knows a lot more about that than I do. But Churchill was very generous in his discussion about that. He made sure that everybody in the UK, he was speaking to the United States as well, understood that this was an American battle. There was 30 Corps, I think it was 30 Corps got alerted, and about 1,500 British soldiers were killed in the fighting. They were holding the Meuse River bridges to make sure that if a breakthrough did happen, things were protected, or the rear area was protected. But he was very generous. So in the end, the hurt feelings continued in a battle of memoirs that went on forever until all these guys died. I mean, Bradley's memoir is not very kind to Monty. That stuff goes on, and it's natural. These guys are all human beings, and they all have egos. And Bradley's ego was easily bruised. And so there was when Bradley had to give up command of the 1st Army to 21st Army Group to Field Marshal Montgomery, he was quite upset. And but he was in a position where he couldn't control it. The fight couldn't be controlled. So 21st Army Group, led by Field Marshal Montgomery, took over command of the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies and fought the northern shoulder, while Bradley had 3rd Army and fighting the southern shoulder. And Napoleon used to say he wanted to prefer to fight coalitions because you always have different and competing interests in national coalitions or among nations. And I would argue that, yeah, but if you have good friends, in the end you can work it out. And so we did work it out. But there was lots of angst in the United States, and there was certainly some bitterness that came out of that.
We're going to go over time, but we have one last question. Center aisle towards the back, please.
Can you talk a little bit about why did Enigma go dark, or why they didn't get a sneak peek? That's someone I was kind of listening for. Is like, they have the wire intercepts. Is everything going on the phone line, or why is there no sign in Enigma?
Well, let's show the Enigma picture too, by the way. Let's get that real quick. One of my favorite photographs of World War II, if I can make it happen.
Yeah, they're bringing it back.
Just give it time. They're
Oh,
pulling it
okay,
up.
sorry.
Give it 1 second.
Yeah, I'm trying to push the plunger when there's no dynamite. So to get to the point, though, while this is coming up, they didn't go dark on Ultra. There were still Ultra communications, but as the Germans withdrew, their dependence on radio traffic declined. So a lot of the traffic at the operational, the Corps and Field Army level is going to happen over telephone. But they did continue to communicate. This is my favorite picture of Heinz Guderian, who, by the way, was a signal officer in World War I. This is Heinz Guderian as a Corps commander in Poland. Mm-hmm. And you see he's in a half-track with a frame antenna. The poles or bars you see there is actually an antenna, part of an antenna. And you can see his radio operators and an Enigma machine at the bottom of the picture. So they used Enigma at Corps and so forth when they were fighting on the move. But once you're in the bunkers, you don't need that. And the other thing the Germans did is they went on what we call emissions control. They stopped talking. And when you get into indicators and warning, an indicator is they've moved their guns forward. They've moved their troops forward. That is an indicator. It might be that they're going to attack. That gets you back into capabilities versus intention. So when you look at that, is an indicator a warning? Well, no, it's not. You got to have enough of a pattern to believe that this is what's likely to happen. And when you look at surprise, and there have been a lot of books written about surprise, one of the best is Roberta Wohlstedter's book, Warning and Decision, about Pearl Harbor, is the kind of mistakes that you see made in the Ardennes are made over and over and over. Yom Kippur, 1973. There are plenty of indicators and warnings, but what you do about that is what matters. That's, again, a long answer. Did that get to what you were wanting to hear, sir?
And if not, it can carry on at the book signing table. Ladies and gentlemen, Gregory Fontenot and Bradley Hart.
Okay.
Great.